Hi, in this tutorial we're going to look at doing the method section of your proposal. And what I want you to have open is I want you to go to the reading list and I would like you to download the Jane Stokes article. I would also like you to go to eBook Central. This is from the reading list, and open my reading, Born on Swan Street, south of the Yarra. I'm going to be talking about that in regard to methods. And you may want to download Stokes into NVivo. And then the final thing you want to do is open a Word document and begin to map out what your method section is. Now, with regard to the method section, this is going to be the smallest part of your paper, but it needs to answer these questions. In your method section, you need to explain, I'll just blow this up a little bit, shall I? What's your data set? What's the body of information that you're going to be working with? Is it a set of interviews? Is it a set of field notes you take? Is it a set of comments from a Facebook page? What is it? The next thing you want to talk about is, what does this represent? What you're going to have in your data set is a sample. It's a body of data that represents something about media culture and action. So you need to have a preliminary statement on what that is. Why have you selected this body of data? In terms of, what do you hope to find out? What do you hope it's going to tell you about the general social impact of media? And then the third part is, you need to talk about your method. So what's your method? What does that method aim to do? How does the method go about achieving its goal? And how are you going to apply that method to your data? And in this proposal, I'm going to talk about two methods: content analysis and discourse analysis, which are ways of making sense of qualitative data. And I'm going to be specifically looking at the Jane Stokes chapter to describe what those techniques are. And I suppose the first point to make is that you've probably heard about content analysis before. Broadly, content analysis is kind of an interaction between qualitative and quantitative approaches. It's broadly quantitative in the sense that it involves selecting kind of a set of concepts that you're going to look at in a body of evidence and counting the amount of times a certain concept crops up. And it's quite often used in relation to media content, but you can also use it in relation to the things that people say about media. So if you've got a group of people and you're interviewing them about why they like Instagram or whatever it is, one way to approach that is sort of thinking, well, Instagram can be used for a number of different functions, but what do the group of people that I talk to tend to use it for? So counting those sorts of things can be quite useful. Now, of course, the point that Stokes makes, that's a really good point, is that there's something qualitative about this too, in the sense that when you're doing a content analysis, when you're selecting something that you're going to enumerate in a body of data, that involves a kind of a qualitative interpretive judgment that, this idea that something is particularly important. So there's an interpretive aspect of content analysis, which kind of leads it also into discourse analysis, which is the idea of discourse really is the idea that it grows from the idea that language actually has its own reality effect, that the way that we think and talk about something defines how we act toward it. So it's kind of approaching language as a way of doing things, not just a way of describing or thinking about things. And this has been used in relation to media to describe how media create what would be called a set of subject positions, that is, how media try and position us politically to view the world in a particular way. But it can also be applied to the analysis of what people say about how they use the media, in the sense that we can look at what people say about fairly ordinary things like how they use social media or why they go to the movies or whatever it is, and look for the ways in which they construct different kind of identities in relation to those activities. So those are some of the big ideas I'm going to go through, but what I'm going to do is show again how you can use NVivo to kind of go through the readings structurally and answer all of these questions. Then I'm going to be talking about something which is quite important, because Stokes represents is a good reading on general approaches to doing social research, to analysing data. But the challenge you face is thinking about and explaining how the general principles that she outlines apply to the particularities of your data. So what I'm going to do is explain how some of the big ideas from Stokes on the nature, purpose and functions of content analysis and discourse analysis can be used to understand how I approached a research project on online soccer fans. So in moving from Stokes to my article, I'm going to be demonstrating how you can move from the general principles of content analysis and discourse analysis to the particular application of those principles to a particular body of work. In this case, the analysis of a particular a particular online forum thread, a particular discussion, and how that combined aspects of qualitative and quantitative data. And then the point is, and this is really important, that you're going to have to do something similar, take general methods and apply them to a particular study on your topic. But at any rate, this is what your method section should look like. This is all of the answers, all of the questions that you should be able to answer. So this you can take as a structure for your method section. So now let's go over to the question is, how do we answer these questions? And again, what we can do is we can do that in relation to NVivo, and we can show again how putting NVivo to use for literature reviews can actually help organize your writing as you go. So I've already showed you how to do coding for NVivo. What I've done is I've put the Stokes reading as one of the internals here. And I've kind of known that there are two things that I want to get out of this particular reading. And I want to get a particular handle on precise methods. And what that means is I want to be able to do two things in regard to these methods. So there's two methods. One's content analysis and the other is discourse analysis. So I've created those as nodes. Then underneath this, I've also got what is it? So I want to be able to define content analysis and discourse analysis. So I've created a sub node. So again, what I've done, you know how to do that. You click on here and create a node, a new node, and then it goes underneath there. So what is it and how is it done? What is it and how is it done? So what is content analysis? What does it aim to do? How does it do it? What is discourse analysis? What does it aim to do? And how does it do it? If you see over here, what I've done is I've clicked the View tab. If I go into Coding Stripes, what I've done is I've actually asked this to highlight all of the places where the article where I've got the answers to some of these questions. So what you'll see is what I've done is I've kind of gone through these articles to look for definitions of content analysis and discourse analysis, examples of how it's done, and then also what I've done is I've in certain places added an annotation to explain what a method is in my own words. Okay, so here I've got a definition of what content analysis is, and it says here I've read this particular section, I've highlighted it, and I've added in an annotation. This suggests that content analysis, counting elements of a collection of data, is a way of determining dominant themes in a body of material. So what I've gone through all of this, and then again, here's a definition of how content analysis is done. Content analysis requires the coding of variables according to criteria determined by the researcher. Okay, so this is one of the steps. So you know that this is one of the steps that you're going to have to take if you're doing content analysis. If we look at what I've coded underneath the nodes, we've got two definitions here. Content analysis then is a method of analyzing textual material and summing the occurrences of specific phenomena such as specific words or images. And it's been used, for example, to look at ideological bias in regard to news. But what this tells us is that content analysis as a method is a way of looking for the recurrence of dominant ideological themes in any kind of content. Sort of a way of identifying how people define social reality in relation to a set of particular ideas. And sometimes it's useful just to count how often that happens in a body, how often a particular idea crops up in a body of data. An example of how you might do this, you might kind of look at the entire archive and look for the number of times that we talk about fear, for example. You know, how often do people talk about how often do people talk about being scared by the media, something like that. And then also what I've done, coded parts of the article that tell you exactly how different researchers have done content analysis. Okay. So down here is interesting. This is an example of how content analysis has been used in relation to interviews with people. So what this tells us is that sometimes in order to make sense of a set of interview data or a set of online discussions, it can be worth counting certain aspects of evidence. You know, the idea that certain sorts of ideas crop up again and again and again. Then discourse analysis. And I've gone through, and again, I've looked for definitions of discourse analysis. So this is taken from Rose. Discourse refers to a group of statements which structure the way a thing is thought and the way we act on the basis of that thinking. And the idea that discourse analysis has been used in media studies to investigate the construction of dominant ideologies. So we have here the idea that discourse analysis sets out to make sense of how social reality is made in relation to media. And this can be either in relation to media content, the idea that certain media content encourages us to see the world in a particular way, or in relation to how people view the media, what they're for, and how they adopt identities in relation to it. So the thing you'd have to do here is you'd have to take quotes like this and explain what they mean in their own terms. And then also gone through and coded examples of how discourse analysis is done. And essentially what we see from, and you should read the Stokes for yourself, like for example, in one of the examples that Stokes talks about, she talks about a piece of audience research that used discourse analysis to look out for those places where people thought critically about the media. So it was an example of soldiers in Iraq who sort of used online war blogs as a way of thinking about what they didn't like about television news, for example. So again, what is it and how is it done? Now, the other thing that's really important about the Stokes article is that she also, if we move down here, goes through a set of steps that you need to do in order to do content analysis and discourse analysis. And one is define your category. So before you go into a body of evidence and in your method section, what you need to explain is what you're going to look for in your evidence and why you're looking for that information. And then similarly, there are some useful steps down here on how to go about the processes and the steps of discourse analysis. So stages in discourse analysis. So what you have to do here is select a body of evidence and explain why you're going to use it. You need to have a really good read through it. And then you need to identify a way of identifying how your evidence is constructing particular subject positions, that is, particular ways of looking at the world. So that all sounds perhaps a little bit abstract, but one example of how this has worked, if we can go over to my article on the Melbourne Heart, Melbourne City now, but when Melbourne Heart were put together, I wanted to know why Australian fans were going to support the Melbourne Heart. And so if we think about, so I had this general kind of interest in how the construction of the Melbourne Heart reflected what David Rowe calls the sports biz, the sort of the way in which sport has been moulded into a particular sort of media entertainment in relation to commercial interests and media interests. And it seemed to me, so if we're thinking about classic methodological issues, if you look at what I've done here, I've taken an online thread on an online forum talking about the construction where potential supporters talked about the new team, the Melbourne Heart, and why they either were or were not going to support them. So what I explain here is two things really. Firstly, what is my data set and what does it represent? Why is it an interesting, a useful thing, a valid thing to look at? And how am I going to begin to cut it up? So what I've done is I've explained here that I've selected a fan website and a particular thread that talked about whether or not people were going to support this club. I've talked about how many posts there were. I've defined why this is a meaningful period of time over which to collect a number of posts. I've defined what the here I've defined what the data represents, and here I've explained how I've developed categories. So you've got all of these people talking about all kinds of things, and what I've done is I've looked for categories which reflect the dominant themes in academic discussions on the mediatization of sport. So I've looked for where people talked about the commercialization of sport. I've looked for sections where people talked quite explicitly about the role of media in constructing the club. I've talked about places, I've was looking for where people were talking about sort of the traditional aspects of sport, how people felt about the new stadium, and where people reflected critically on the role of media in constructing the new club. So what you find then is what I've done is I've selected a meaningful data set, and I've analyzed it using a set of categories which are grounded in existing literature on media and sport, particularly around the idea that sport is becoming increasingly driven by media interests, and looking for places where people have talked about that. And then if you look later on in the article, what I've done is I've done both content analysis and discourse analysis, in the sense that I've talked about the number of times people have talked about particular issues, and then sort of gone deeper into the quotes to talk about how people make sense of particular issues in particular ways. So here is, so down here what I did was kind of, one of the things that I looked for was, the fact that most of the quotes, most of the conversation was actually about what the name of the club was going to be and what the colour of the strip was going to be. And very little was about kind of the politics of soccer. And then further down in the article, I've kind of gone more deeply into some of the exact quotes to talk about how people constructed images of themselves and constructed particular identities through the medium of this soccer supporter. So that was what I did. So what was my data set? An online forum in a particular period leading up to the Melbourne Hearts first season. What did it represent? Well, it represented a unique occasion where soccer fans were thinking explicitly about their role in building a new sporting media phenomenon. It represented something where fans were given an opportunity to reflect on the authenticity of the construction of a media sports business, and talk about it in kind of explicit ways. So it's interesting from a theoretical point of view. What was my method? Well, I wanted to know what people talked about the most. I wanted to know how much people talked about political issues related to sport. How did I do that? Well, I went through and coded what people were talking about most of the time, and most of the time it was simply things like the colour of the strips and what they wanted the strip to be and what they wanted the badge to be. And then how I applied quantitative and qualitative methods to the data. I used a quantitative approach just to talk about what most of the people talked about most of the time. And then I used a qualitative discourse analysis approach to talk about how people adopted certain kinds of identities by talking in particular ways about particular issues. So that's how I would answer all of those questions. So you have to do something similar. What you have to do is take the general methods from Stokes, and of course it doesn't just have to be Stokes. You could use Babby on participant observation. You could use some of the earlier article. You could use Nick Couldry on participant observation. You could use my article on autoethnography. But again, whatever it is, what's your data set? What does it represent? What's the method? What does it aim to do? How does it do it? And how are you going to apply it to your data? You need to be able to answer all of those questions. And probably one thing to do would be to actually to apply Stokes or Babby to a study which is on the topic that you want to study, and see if you can do something similar to what I've done in this tutorial. Anyway, what you really need to do before Tuesday is you need to go through this process and then bring any questions, any problems that you're having with that to class. So that's how to do the method section. Thanks.